William Blake begins Milton with the call to rouse up, O young men of the New Age. Blake's line is sometimes given as the source of the term New Age, as used to describe the spiritual movement of the 1970s. And Blake has long been recognized as an important influence on the poets and visual artists of the counterculture, as we've been hearing with Allen Ginsberg, for example. In the passage from Milton, Blake goes on to call on painters, sculptors, and architects to join him in his artistic mission. It could be argued, however, that it was a cohort of musicians that best manifested his vision for art during the 70s and early 80s. I refer to the rise of what's become known as New Age music, and in this presentation, I will outline a series of resonances between Blake and the pioneers of that genre, some of which can be seen here, and we'll revisit a few of these characters. Blake is often held up as a paradigmatic example of a visionary artist, and he offers a useful point of comparison to the New Age musicians of this era, who, I argue, brought a similar approach to the realm of recorded music. Visionary art usually gets talked about in a visual register, and I'm interested in when it is happening in an audio form. In this talk, I'll provide some brief historical context for the rise of New Age music, and then consider a set of shared themes and practices linking them to Blake: the importance of non-ordinary states of consciousness, a distinctive mode of home production, an outsider status in relation to established musical art worlds, and the interweaving of ancient and contemporary motifs. First, some context. New Age music's earliest exposure came via cassettes and LPs that were sold at metaphysical bookstores, like the Bodhi Tree in Los Angeles, as well as in health food stores. So not the usual route of record stores, but metaphysical bookstores, health food stores. Cassette tapes were an important factor in the early circulation of New Age music. And actually, to follow on Andreo's interesting talk, it's something that New Age music shares with heavy metal. It's kind of an interesting linkage between what might seem very different genres, but both cassette tapes, very important, happening in that era. Tapes were small and portable, which made them easy to display in retail spaces like bookstores and health food stores. And here you see a retail display of cassettes and some early CDs. Musicians also sold their tapes at New Age fairs and festivals, like the Festival for Mind, Body, Spirit, first held in London in 1977, and the Rainbow Rose Festival. It was radio, however, that really made New Age music into a national phenomenon in the US. Regional airplay began in the early 1970s, most notably on Stephen Hill and Anna Turner's Music from the Hearts of Space from KPFA in Berkeley, which won on the air in 1973 and was nationally syndicated in 1983. Late night radio programs, like Music from the Hearts of Space, along with reviews and advertising in New Age magazines, completed the infrastructural foundation for New Age music. And that infrastructure was alternative to the extent that it existed outside the mainstream music industry. It was alternative because it shared with the New Age movement, a deviant status with regards to prevailing religious and scientific orthodoxies. And it was alternative because it was a visionary art movement. And with regards to that, we're now ready to begin a comparison with the paradigmatic visionary artist, William Blake. As is well known, Blake is famous for his visions, and visionary experiences were central to his artistic work. Many of the first wave of New Age artists had similar numinous experiences of one kind or another. Iasos began hearing heavenly music in his head in the late 1960s, and in 1973 he had a life-changing experience during a session of automatic writing, when he forged a relationship with a spiritual being that had been transmitting musical visions into his mind. Iasos believed that he and this entity had made an agreement to work together before he had been born. Iasos was outspoken about this collaborative creative process, and his first album is credited as having been created not by Iasos, but through Iasos. Iasos's heavenly music is representative of how, for this cohort of musicians, visionary experience took a sonic form. Another example, Stephen Halpern had a cosmic experience of sound in 1969, notably while he was on his way to see William Blake manuscripts at the University of Santa Cruz. During a meditation session in the Redwoods, he heard tinkling crystalline sounds and a voice saying, "This is the music you've been praying to hear." These sounds became the blueprint for the album Spectrum Suite. And Iasos and Stephen Halpern are often credited as being the kind of forefathers of this genre in the 70s. Both released their first albums in 1975. Another pioneer of New Age music, Laraaji, had a profound experience in 1974 when a soundtrack for eternal time became audible to him. This took the form of multiple layers of brass instruments weaving and jamming and exploring space timelessness as sound, and this shaped all of his subsequent recordings. For several New Age musicians, near-death experiences with a powerful sonic component oriented their work towards the cosmic concerns of visionary art. And coming of age in the 60s, most of them had formative experience with psychedelic drugs. As with many in the New Age movement more broadly, these musicians wanted to deepen and extend the consciousness-altering potential of the psychedelic revolution. In a book that was very influential on this cohort entitled Through Music to the Self, the composer Peter Michael Hamel wrote that what drugs failed to achieve, the creation of a genuine, lasting intensification of awareness, could become possible through a new experience and appreciation of music. All the New Age musicians of this era with whom I've spoken, and I'm doing a kind of an oral history project, interviewing many of these people, describe sources of inspiration coming from non-ordinary states of consciousness, be that visions, dreams, near-death experiences, psychedelic drugs, or spiritual practices. This was a cohort of artists who shared Blake's visionary orientation. Not only did these musicians have these kinds of experiences, but they talked openly about them and made music saturated with their numinous emotional qualities. The overt connection between their works and such deviant experiences was one factor that tended to push New Age musicians to the cultural periphery, defining them as outsiders in the fields of both popular and academic music. And outsider status is the second characteristic that the New Age musicians share with William Blake. The genre of visionary art sometimes overlaps with the category of outsider art, which tends to be defined on an assumption that the artist has a lack of training or formal education. W.J.T. Mitchell notes the limitations of that definition. To qualify as an outsider artist, he writes, one should be either untrained or mentally ill, preferably both. William Blake, Mitchell notes, is arguably the first and most famous outsider artist in the Western canon, but he does not fit the model since he was far from untrained, apprenticing as a journeyman engraver, making his living in that trade, and studying for a time at the Royal Academy. The pioneers of New Age music also often had considerable musical training, and yet were not integrated into either the popular music industry or the world of contemporary classical music. In fact, several had studied in universities but left because they found the dominant style of atonal music to be restrictive. Peter Davison studied at Cal State Northridge and UC San Diego, where his teachers and peers rejected traditional harmony. This felt restrictive to him, and he decided, I love chords, I love harmony. And that was his frame of mind in 1979 when he began recording tracks for his first New Age album. Tim Clark had a similar experience studying composition at Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. I got locked into writing atonal serial music, he said. I hated it, but I did it. Every time I would put in a little major chord, they would say, no, you can't do that. In 1970, after 1 year in a PhD program, he dropped out and started making music that ended up being played on Music from the Hearts of Space. As you can see, these and other New Age musicians had professional training. They were not outsiders to musical composition in that regard. Rather than the outsider artist designation, the school of New Age pioneers, and I would argue Blake as well, are hybrids, legible primarily as what Howard Becker would call mavericks, with a peripheral place in relation to dominant art worlds, although their mystical experiences and visionary discourse tends to nudge them into the outsider, or what Becker calls naive artist zone. As we've seen, New Age artists responded to their outsider status by creating their own alternative distribution network using cassettes and bookstores and health food stores. And they could supply that network with their innovative compositions because of their self-sufficient approach to the latest audio tools. This is my third point of comparison. William Blake's primary artistic method was relief etching, drawing on a copper plate with an acid-resistant varnish, etching away the metal to reveal a design in relief, printing the plates on his own press and coloring them by hand. Blake's method meant that he had a remarkable amount of control over the entire creative process. He was a writer, artist, engraver, binder, and publisher all in one. That level of control was important for Blake, in part because his was a deeply spiritual and visionary undertaking. Likewise, New Age artists mobilized the latest audio technology to become remarkably self-sufficient as composers, recording artists, and distributors. New Age music crystallized in an era of magnetic tape recording, which meant portable cassette tapes on the distribution side and multi-track tape recorders on the production side, like the ones we see Deuter using here. With their training in audio, this cohort could operate newly affordable home recording systems and avoid paying expensive fees for studio time, engineers, and session musicians. I do it all myself, Iasos said. In the old days, before multi-track recording, you needed to have multiple musicians, but nowadays, one person can do it all. Iasos made a comparison between music and painting. If painters can create a work by themselves, why do they need someone else to paint the clouds, the trees, and the landscapes? Steve Roach also made a comparison to painting. The music industry developed a model, he says, by which recording occurred in $200 an hour studio spaces. It would be like if you had a history of painting where painters were only allowed to work in that kind of commercial institutional context. What kind of paintings would they have created in that kind of environment, he wondered. Roach decided early in his career that that wasn't the way for him, that he needed an alternative way to make recordings and set about acquiring tools and finding his own, quote, sacred, quiet, controlled space. As it was for Blake, this process was a sacred, a spiritual one for New Age musicians like Roach and Iasos. In fact, Iasos described his home studio as an electric altar and a sacred temple dedicated to receiving musical ideas from higher dimensions. A 1979 documentary gives us a glimpse at Iasos' home studio from this era. We see multiple reel-to-reel tape recorders, cassette decks, graphic equalizers, keyboards, and walls covered with visionary paintings, images of landscapes, and spiritual teachers. Part of what made the New Age home studio possible was the availability not only of tape recorders, but modular synthesizers. New Age composers were early adopters of synths designed by Robert Moog, Don Buchla, and Serge Cherepnin. And in many cases, New Age musicians worked closely with these designers. We're looking at Kevin Braheny Fortune's Mighty Surge, which he made, and he worked with Serge Cherepnin, who was one of these pioneers of modular synthesizers. Likewise, Peter Davison built some of the first Serge synths, and you see one on the cover of his first album. Kat Eppel of the New Age duo Emerald Webb learned to play early Moog and Buchla units while she was at the University of Southern Florida. Modular synths appealed to Kat Eppel because they provided more control to play a whole orchestra rather than one instrument within it. And it also enabled a new way of thinking about music. Eppel said that it was not just playing the notes that you wrote, it was creating whole new sounds. And I want to dig into that a little bit. Modular synths were an important part of the self-sufficient New Age home studio. And as Eppel's comments show, they provided a new way to think about making music. This is related to how these electronic instruments created new sound by means of what's called additive and subtractive synthesis. Additive synthesis involves constructing sounds by adding together and blending the tones created by multiple oscillators. Subtractive synthesis begins with the sound wave that contains all the content of the final sound and then modifies and filters it to produce a final result. Subtractive synthesis is often compared to sculpture. Filtering a sound is like the sculptor chipping away at a block of stone. The modular synths of the 60s and 70s are most often described in terms of this kind of subtractive synthesis. And though it's often compared to a sculptor removing stone to find a statue within it, it also resembles Blake's relief etching. In the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake describes his technique as printing in the infernal method by corrosives, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. This is followed by his famous assertion that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. There's a beautiful symmetry then, I think, between Blake's infernal method and the subtractive synthesis of the New Age musicians. Both were techniques to melt away surfaces and cleanse the doors of artistic perception. Modular synths were not the only important New Age instruments. There were many New Age flute players, and the harp is another prominent instrument. In fact, Gail Lawton's Harps of Ancient Temples is often listed as one of the very first New Age albums. Now this highlights something that's distinctive about this era of New Age music. In the Music from the Hearts of Space Guide to New Age music, there's even a subcategory of contemporary ancient, music made today with awareness of the sounds and expressions of the deep past. This is characteristic of the temporality of both New Age music and visionary art, and it's a final point of comparison in my presentation between Blake and New Age music. Visionary experiences are powerful in part because they give one the sense of stepping out of linear everyday time and making contact with eternity. As a channel for sharing that experience, visionary art tends to insist on a transpersonal, transtemporal field of resonance outside of historical time. This is certainly the case with Blake, and Mitchell describes uncertainty about Blake's proper historical location. If Blake did not quite fit in his own time, it is largely because he located himself and his work outside of, or across all time altogether, in an atemporal region he called eternity, writes Mitchell. Another ramification of the visionary artist's transtemporal field of resonance is a belief that, to use the title of one of Blake's first works, all religions are one. A similar assertion is a strong component in the New Age movement of the 70s and 80s, which had what's been called a perennialized outlook that went beyond individual spiritual traditions to try to find an inner esoteric core that united them. This meant that New Agers tended to draw on traditions while bypassing their explicit doctrines, dogmas, and moral codes. Kitaro, one of the breakout stars of New Age music in the late 1980s, told an interviewer, "I accept all religions to be alike, just different names for the same thing." And Iasos stated, "I see my music as outside of time." Such an orientation to time can help to explain the New Age soundscape, which finds no contradiction in the combination of the most modern synthesizers and traditional instruments like harps, flutes, and didgeridoos. So, in conclusion, the New Age home studio was the site of visionary practice and an infernal method of audio creation that resulted in a new kind of sacred music, one that was in tune with the vibrant alternative spirituality of the times. Like William Blake, the visionary school of New Age music sought to use contemporary artistic systems to deliver individuals from those systems. That is, to mobilize innovative modes of audio creation and circulation to provide glimpses of another way of being in, perceiving, and thinking about the world.